Dishonored 2 opened with an optional tutorial sequence played from the perspective of protagonist Emily Caldwin, where your mentor, Corvo, trains you in the art of stealth and combat. Outside of this tutorial sequence, your most important power of Blink gets introduced to you in a void world where long stretches of nothingness act as an obstacle course for you to try out this new power. In Dishonored Death of the Outsider, there is no formal tutorial, and at the start of the second level you are given all of your magical powers at once, with the closest thing to an introduction being an abrupt paragraph of text disrupting what you are doing, and a video you can watch in-game that demonstrates the power. It's not that I found Death of the Outsider confusing, or that I didn't understand the new spells, it's just a bit unceremonious. I don't even think Dishonored 2 had an excellent or even great tutorial. It didn't stand out to me in any way at first, but it's something I couldn't get out of my head once I played Death of the Outsider, and it's the contrast in quality that serves as a microcosm of my general thoughts on this expansion. Death of the Outsider is a smaller and unfortunately lesser version of Dishonored 2. Fortunately for Death of the Outsider's sake, a lesser version of a truly exceptional game still gives plenty of room to operate, but expectations really need to be aligned going into it, because context is important. Dishonored Death of the Outsider released in September of 2017, just shy of a year following Dishonored 2's November 2016 release. Originally planned as a DLC for Dishonored 2, Death of the Outsider spun off into its own title and became what was advertised as a standalone expansion for $30. That budget price tag informs a lot of what you need to know about this game. It is a smaller and shorter game than what came before it, with 5 levels compared to the previous game's 9. 2 of those 5 levels at least partially share an outdoor environment, and one of the levels is a slightly reworked version of a mission from the second game. Smaller quantity is to be expected from this standalone expansion. It's the quality I want to talk about for the rest of this review. Death of the Outsider acts as a sequel to the events of Dishonored 2. With Dunwall hitting its quota of coups for the decade, the perspective of the game is allowed to shift from the royal family into a side character from previous entries, Billy Lurk. Audio logs and notes throughout Game 2 make it clear that her ultimate goal is to track down her long-lost mentor Dowd after he had been exiled by Corvo. If you read the Return of Dowd novel, you know exactly what Dowd was up to during this time, and his goals in the book tie into the story of the game. Dowd wants to kill the Outsider. By the time you finish Mission 1, you'll have synced up with Dowd and his goals become yours, and the next 4 missions are spent tracking down and attempting to kill the Outsider. The story has its moments, but overall it's my least favorite among the 3 games for 2 major reasons. First, because it doubles down on the least interesting mystical bits of the Dishonored universe instead of the actually interesting 1800s whaling industry-based setting and the court intrigue. And second, because there's not really enough room for what story is here to breathe. The pacing is super off, and dramatic events that feel like they deserve to hold some serious weight end up flying by you before you even realize what's happened. And those of you who have played the game know exactly what I'm talking about. The characters are a bit less interesting this time around too. Billy's actual goal gets realized by the end of the first mission when she finds Dowd, and from there her motives exist only as an extension of Dowd's. His fixation on killing the Outsider doesn't really feel like it's been given enough screen time or explanation to be justified either, and that includes within the complementary material. Rewatching the ending for the Brigmore Witches DLC shows that Dowd recognizes that actions have consequences, and he feels rightly responsible for the fallout surrounding Jessamyn's death. The blaming of the Outsider feels incompatible with the Dowd I understood from previous games. I had my issues with how Dowd's storyline played out in the Dishonored 1 DLCs, but if recognizing that he couldn't undo the sins of his past but could do his damnedest to atone for them wasn't the point, then I don't know what was. Death of the Outsider feels like it undoes Dowd's entire story, and there really isn't any good payoff for doing so. The story, characters, and pacing really do disappoint, but how is the gameplay? After 2 playthroughs, I can say it's definitely a bit of a mixed bag, but there is definitely wheat for its chaff. Billy Lurk is just as stealthy and just as good with a blade as Emily and Corvo, with largely the same set of lethal and non-lethal equipment to help her through the game. The differences come into play when it comes to the powers. Billy is given a set of only 3 powers. Her variation on Blink is that she can lock into a location ahead of time and then snap there with a second click, killing enemy who is directly there. Her Semblance ability is something entirely new to the series, where she can take over the appearance of another character temporarily, allowing you to sneak by. Her final ability is Death of the Outsider's replacement for Dark Vision from the earlier games. Billy can activate this power and fly around the environment, seeing enemies, their sightlines, and interactable objects in the environment. This is probably my favorite addition in the powers department. On paper, it's pretty similar to its implementation in previous Dishonoreds, but the ability to mark while in this form and the information carrying over into your normal form gives you more means to plan out a room before heading inside. All 3 of these powers also benefit from a slight rework to how mana works in the game. Instead of it being a limited resource that only replenishes to a point and needs to be otherwise refilled with a consumable, Billy's mana is always regenerating. This allows you to be a lot more liberal with your use of your powers, but it's clear that this system couldn't have been used one-to-one in previous games, where the powers were way stronger on their own. The powers in Death of the Outsider work more so as a complement to Billy's physical tools than they do supplements to them. A new addition in the gameplay front outside of powers is contracts. Within each mission, there's a sort of mission board, where you can complete specific tasks and be rewarded with gold to spend in the black market. Dishonored 2 had side objectives you can complete in levels as well, but they're more brought to the surface here in addition to being far more plentiful. Progression has changed as well. Rather than your powers being upgraded by runes you find and spend at your discretion, the progression is handled by the properties of the bone charms you find and augment your characters with. This ends up meaning that you won't exactly have the freedom to experiment with a lot of different builds like in previous games, but it does end up simplifying things and making it less collection heavy, which I think was their intent. Billy and the tools and the powers she wields don't tell the whole story when it comes to the gameplay department, because Dishonored is and always has been driven by the levels you stealth through. Death of the Outsider's levels meet expectations but don't exceed them. With the exception of a really fun bank heist level in the middle of the story, the rest of the levels feel like they fade to the background when I conjure up thoughts of the best missions that this series has to offer. That's not to say that they aren't good, because truly, they are. There's the fine attention to detail, realistic enemy placement, and branching pathways that the series has always had. But that's kind of my point. The series has always had that, and Death of the Outsider doesn't really bring anything new to that department. There's no levels that dramatically change the way you play or even attempt to introduce new mechanics, like Dishonored 1's Party at the Boyle's Manor, or the sequel's Clockwork Mansion, or the time travel based Crack in the Slab. And lack of truly excellent levels like this kills a lot of my motivation to revisit this title in the future. Speaking of revisiting this title, I wouldn't be giving this game a true Dishonored review if I didn't talk about how it handles multiple playthroughs, because there's more change on this front than I was expecting. Death of the Outsider introduces a new spin on New Game Plus called Original Game Plus, that allows you to run it back through the campaign with a cherry-picked selection of 3 powers from Dishonored 2. It's interesting at first, but the extremely small selection of powers and the fact that these levels were designed with Billy's powers in mind make this feel like a small side mode rather than a thoughtful inclusion. More important to note is probably the lack of chaos system. Dishonored 1 and 2 would gauge your level of lethality and then make changes to the world, story, and enemies based on that. Death of the Outsider still allows you to play lethally or non-lethally, but it ends up being more of a self-imposed challenge here. The world won't shape itself to those decisions at all, with the exception of you getting to pick your ending in the game's final moments. Maybe the developers wanted to push you into a lethal playthrough to match the vindictive and tired nature of Billy, or maybe they didn't want to discourage you from using the entirety of the game's toolset. I could entertain them wanting to shake up the chaos system because I can see how it's not perfect, but here it feels like it was just removed outright with no real replacement, and it's hard not to feel like this was another budgetary restriction more so than it was a purposeful change. My issue with this lack of reactivity is the same as my issue with the lack of groundbreaking new levels, and the lack of interesting characters or villains, and the lack of a real introduction to powers or tutorial. Dishonored Death of the Outsider feels like a minimum viable product. It feels like the bare minimum that the game needed to be in order for this brand to be put on the cover. That may sound harsh, and the rest of this review may have sounded harsh too, but it comes from knowing that this series can be and has been so much more. That's not even to say that I didn't have fun at points, because I did. Underneath all of my whining, this game is fine. It is a competently made, totally fine budget game that has the unfortunate distinction of being the only fine game in a series of excellent games. After finishing Dishonored 2, I immediately wanted to play it again. Likewise, after finishing Death of the Outsider, I also wanted to immediately play Dishonored 2 again.